Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we are wading into, well, a pretty intense professional conflict.
It's one that, on the surface, looks like it's about science, but as we'll see, it might be more about a seismic shift in power.
That's right. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating, and I have to say, highly critical analysis. It challenges some foundational assumptions about how we view language development.
Especially for autistic communication.
Exactly. Our source material is a powerful critique by Jaime Hoerricks, a PhD who also identifies as an ADHD Gestalt processor.
And the piece is called When Proximity Becomes a Weapon. It's a direct response to a professional paper about Gestalt Language Processing, or GLP.
A paper published by ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association. So we're talking about the establishment here.
Very much so.
And our mission today is to really unpack the author's argument, because Hoerricks claims this isn't some honest scientific misunderstanding.
No, not at all. They frame it as a very old pattern repeating itself.
A declaration that, and this is a quote, autistic meaning belongs to us alone. A fight against systems built on what the author calls analytic supremacy.
And colonial language politics. I mean, these are very strong words.
They are. It's why this feels less like an academic debate and more like, well, an existential battle for the people involved.
It really starts with this visceral reaction the author describes, just opening the ASHA paper.
What did they say?
They talk about a familiar lurch in the stomach, a tightening in the chest, just this sinking feeling of being about to be interpreted, not understood, dissected, not held.
Wow. That one quote just immediately frames the stakes, doesn't it?
It does. The whole piece is built on that tension. The ASHA paper presents itself as a gentle intervention, calling for balance and caution.
Based on professional experience.
Right. But Hoerricks just dismisses that framing entirely. They say the paper is Hutchins again.
Okay, that sounds like a historical reference. What does that mean?
It's a crucial one. The author is signaling that the profession is just defaulting to its old template.
Which is?
Treating analytic processing, the standard word-by-word linear way of learning language, as the gold standard.
And then casting gestalts, these whole phrases people learn, as something less than.
Exactly, as a primitive shadow of real language that needs to be fixed or refined.
Okay, so let's unpack that. This really gets to the core philosophical rift over what a gestalt even is. Hoerricks points to what they call omission #1.
And that's the failure of the professional paper, to even ask what gestalts mean to the people who actually use them.
So it's prioritizing the clinical interpretation over the lived experience.
Precisely. And the source draws this incredible contrast. For the professionals being critiqued, a gestalt is a puzzle.
Something to be solved, broken down, decoded.
Yes, so it can be replaced by what they consider original generative language.
But for the author, it's completely different.
For the author, a gestalt is a world. They're described as containers of memory and sensation.
So they're not just random phrases. They hold something important.
They hold a moment of safety or desire. The author says a gestalt is a reliable bridge between an unspeakable interior and a world that demands vocabulary we do not have.
That's beautiful. And the key insight there is the feeling arrived whole.
So the language used to express it also arrives whole.
Which leads right into the big critique of the clinical practice itself, this insistence on dissection.
Right. The author argues that this clinical drive to break gestalts into smaller pieces isn't for the client's benefit at all.
It's because, and I'm quoting again, the intact form unnerves you.
It unnerves the professional because their framework, their whole training, can't handle an expression of meaning that doesn't fit neatly into their little linguistic boxes.
So that claim about the clinician's need for mastery really reframes the whole therapy session. It's not about clarity for the client.
It's about control over the data for the clinician.
Wow.
And the source connects this directly to what they call a colonial echo.
Explain that.
The argument is that meaning is only seen as legitimate if it can be mapped onto the professional structure.
A structure derived from the majority neurotypical communication style.
So the professional acts like a colonizer, demanding translation into their categories before they'll recognize the native meaning as valid.
And if that meaning resists translation like a gestalt does, it just gets dismissed.
Right, as superstition, poetry, confusion, immaturity. It's an erasure of a different way of knowing.
So this whole GLP debate becomes an issue of linguistic dominance, not just difference.
It is. If you can't translate your inner world into their mandated structure, the system just sees your communication as raw data that needs to be refined. And that refinement is, well, a process of invalidation.
So if the problem is that gestalts are being dissected for the clinician's benefit, that leads us straight to the source's second major critique,
The mission #2.
which is about how these clinical authors established their authority in the first place.
Yeah, this one is about credentials. They appeal to their authority by stating they work with autistic children. But the source points out they provide not a single vignette, not one story from their actual practice to back up their claims.
The source calls that extraction without relationship. That's a serious ethical claim.
It is. The argument is that the paper uses the lives of marginalized children as raw material to build a credential.
While denying those same children a voice.
The children exist only as a credential, never as colleagues in meaning-making.
And this is where the source brings in that very, very strong analogy for the paper's closing statement.
The one where the authors say, "We are not autistic, but we work with autistic children."
Yes. The source calls this the "I have a black friend" defense, or, in their words, proximity innocence.
And that raises this critical question. How can proximity become a weapon?
Right, because you'd think being close to the community would be a good thing.
You would. But the author argues that proximity is being offered up as proof of innocence or neutrality.
But Hoerricks counters that proximity without accountability does not reduce harm, it concentrates it.
That's such a sharp way to put it. The professionals who are closest to the children have the greatest power to wound them, even unintentionally.
And so they have a greater responsibility to be accountable, which the lack of stories suggests they aren't.
The source basically concludes that anyone who uses that defense, "We are not autistic, but," has already declared their position.
Which is that the authority to interpret resides with the non-autistic professional.
Right. The statement acts as a shield. It uses that closeness not to amplify the children's meaning, but to protect their own elevated position in the hierarchy.
Okay, let's pivot from the specific critiques of this one paper to the systemic problem, which the author argues is the real engine behind all this resistance.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
The source identifies the core ideological issue as analytic supremacy.
Analytic supremacy. It's this deep-seated doctrine, inherited from behaviorist traditions and really cemented by institutions like ASHA.
What is the doctrine?
It's the idea that language must be broken down into its smallest pieces. Phones, morphemes, single words, to be seen as legitimate.
So under that worldview, gestalts can't be a valid form of communication on their own.
They're just seen as immature. A primitive stage you have to get through to reach the real goal of linear, decontextualized language.
If you can't neatly divide it up for analysis, it's not real language.
That's the argument. And this paradigm was crucial for establishing the professional authority of speech-language pathology in the first place.
So institutions like ASHA were built on standardizing language.
And by extension, pathologizing difference. Anything that deviates from that one expected linear path is treated as a deficit, a delay, something to be corrected.
That context is so important. It shows this fight over GLP is really a fight against the entire historical structure of the discipline.
It is. And now we have to talk about the money.
The money question. The source is very explicit that this academic fight is also a financial one.
Absolutely. The argument is that GLP destabilizes the entire revenue structure of analytic intervention.
Okay, break that down. What does that mean in practice?
Well, think about it. If you accept gestalts as valid, intact units of communication, a huge amount of traditional clinical work,
Like
assessment tools that break down language, expensive training programs, all the billing codes tied to those fragmented piece-by-piece interventions.
it's all threatened.
Suddenly, it's all threatened. If the evidence says intervention should start with whole phrases and context, you don't need a year of drilling single words.
So if autistic communication is recognized as legitimate in its own form,
Large chunks of the clinical economy just become unnecessary.
and the source points out the timing of all this is a bit suspicious.
Very. They note that these cautionary papers really ramped up right when private finance discovered language therapy as an investment opportunity.
So once the field became a marketplace,
Autistic children became, in the source's framing, commodities. Commodities that needed to be disciplined into standardized forms.
forms that can be packaged, billed, and sold effectively. And GLP messes that up.
It breaks the whole standardization process. So the argument is that these professional papers are really just trying to reassert the myth that only analytic, clinician-driven intervention is legitimate,
All to protect a financial monopoly.
cloaked in the language of professional concern.
This brings us to the source's turning point, the Declaration of Independence.
After documenting all the flaws in the existing system, the author just announces a major shift. Quote, "We are done trying to fix your house."
So no more trying to reform from within.
No. They detail how attempts at reform, these rounds of stakeholder engagement, they only ever led to minor edits, never a fundamental shift in power or belief.
So the focus is no longer on getting a seat at the table?
It's on building a whole new house, a parallel alternative field.
So describe this vision. It's not just a tweaked version of speech-language pathology.
No, it's a completely new discipline called multimodal communication and literacy.
Okay, what does that look like?
It's a field that's fluent in wholes. It treats different ways of communicating as complete and valid from the very beginning.
The source uses some really poetic examples here.
They do, like treating echolalia as poetry and seeing AAC not as a clinical tool for requests, but as architecture for building meaning.
And the foundation is completely different, especially when it comes to who holds the authority.
Absolutely. Autistic and GLP adults would be the founders, co-authors of the ethics, the pedagogy, the research.
So first-person meaning becomes the gold standard of evidence.
Instantly, which dismantles the need for an outside professional interpreter. Gestalts are just recognized as intact units of truth.
And the source also argues this field has to be multilingual from day one.
Right. If you start with the idea that communication naturally crosses languages and modalities, then the multilingual GLP child isn't an exception. They become the template.
So the training would be totally different.
It would start with autistic epistemology, how autistic people experience the world, and sensory attunement, not with a list of pathologies to fix.
And who belongs in this new landscape?
The source is very clear. Autistic GLP practitioners, educators who get whole-to-part learning, ASC specialists who attune rather than control,
Yeah.
and, crucially,
Allied SLPs.
allied SLPs, yes, but only if they're willing to decenter their training and submit to this new authority structure.
This deep dive has, it's really shown how complex this conflict is. The fight over GLP is so much more than a scientific debate.
It's fundamentally a power struggle over who holds epistemic authority, who gets to define what is true.
And it's driven by this deep ideological allegiance to analytic supremacy, and we can't forget the need to protect a massive entrenched clinical economy.
And the source concludes this whole critique with such a powerful declaration of independence. It says that legitimacy for this new field was never something they had the right to grant.
It's a refusal to ask for permission, a refusal to seek validation from the very institutions the author claims have historically invalidated them.
And that refusal, that's what signals this huge paradigm shift. The author ends with this line: "You have had a century to tell your stories about us. We are taking the next century for ourselves."
Wow.
And that statement, I think, it signals a pattern we're seeing across so many different professional fields right now.
Right.
It's that moment when marginalized communities, after trying the path of reform, just decide to build their own systems.
Where lived experience doesn't just challenge, but actually replaces traditional centralized expertise as the gold standard.
Exactly. So whether you're looking at medicine or education or communication, watching who gets to create the standards for the next century, that might just be the most important dynamic playing out in our world today.